Hello and welcome to IO Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about Russian energy. We will go through particular areas of this energy: gas, oil, nuclear, renewables, and I'm interested in the development. What's happening with Russian energy, especially during unpleasant events started in 2022. My expert today is Tatiana Mitrova. Hello, Tatiana.
Hello, Martin.
Dr. Tatiana Mitrova is a research fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, School of Public and International Affairs, Columbia. She has over 25 years of experience in dealing with Russian and global energy markets. She was executive director of the Energy Center of the Moscow School of Management, Skolkovo, and also head of research in the Oil and Gas Department in the Energy Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And by the way, she published over 200 publications, so you can Google her name and her research papers, journal articles, and also some books. So, Tatiana, let's start with the first area, and that's nuclear. How successful was Russia or Rosatom before 2022 in nuclear energy? I mean, domestically and internationally. What nuclear energy meant for Russia before the invasion?
So first of all, Martin, thank you for the invitation. And it's really my pleasure to be here. I'll try to address the nuclear questions, though it's not my core area of focus. But generally, I was always responsible for the energy balance, and energy balance in Russia. Nuclear is a very important part of that. Nuclear has always been like a flagship project, both for the Soviet Union and for the Russian Federation. Rosatom, which is controlling the whole cycle of the nuclear energy, and not only energy, as you obviously can understand. It is very closely related to the presidential administration, so it has enormous lobbying potential. It has huge political power in addition to the economic power. Just for your understanding, it is controlling more than 300 monocities. Can you imagine a city which is all focused on nuclear energy production or any equipment production? So it's like a state inside the state. And it was always strongly supported by the government, even after Chernobyl disaster, back in 1980s. It was still a very special energy industry with special conditions, special circumstances, different from oil, gas, coal, and everything else. And in the beginning of the 2000s, when Russian economy started to recover after the transitional period, and domestic energy demand started to grow, obviously, nuclear came at the forefront as, again, like renaissance of nuclear. It was already nearly 20 years after Chernobyl catastrophe, so the memories were not so painful. And Rosatom by that time has got an extremely ambitious long-term program of development. They were planning to commission 2 nuclear blocks per annum. And even Fukushima disaster actually didn't stop these gigantic plans, but the economy did. So starting from 2010, 2011, actually a Russian economy was already slowing down. And if you look at the average GDP growth of the Russian Federation from 2011 until 2021, you will see that it was nearly zero. The economy was stagnant, actually. Obviously, in this situation, energy demand is also not growing that fast. So, frankly, there was not much space for all these new nuclear blocks. And in reality, the program was downgraded significantly. They were postponing many construction projects, and they were also some technical delays which were not planned, but they were just happening. So, summing up, the industry was successful in getting political support and financial support from the government, in lobbying its interests, in protecting its significant place in the balance, yeah, and in the Russian energy strategy. But it was not that successful in real expansion, real construction, real performance. Similarly, with the overseas projects. Rosatom Overseas was an extremely ambitious subsidiary of Rosatom with lots of plans and negotiations around the world, with many projects ongoing simultaneously. But actually, if you look at the end of the day on the number of the nuclear power plants really built during the last 20 years, you will see that it's not that impressive. And those built, many of them also have cost overruns and time delays. So the performance seems to be better in public performance rather than the real deliverables. Nevertheless, I'm sure that as long as possible, the state will still support this industry because though it's not really that economically efficient as it pretends to be in Russia, but it's extremely important from the political and geopolitical point of view. So I hope I've addressed your question.
And just a little follow-up question, Tatiana. What was the position of Rosatom among the competition internationally? Because, when you go to the website or YouTube, the presentation that Rosatom has, what Rosatom is doing abroad is impressive. It's nice video, good talks and everything. But when you were speaking with the scholars and your colleagues, what was the reality of understanding Rosatom abroad before the invasion, because, Rosatom was doing some international projects on one hand, but on the other hand, some people said that presentation was like better than the reality. So how was it in your academic or scholarly circles?
Yeah, that's the same point that I'm making, that presentation better than reality. Actually, Rosatom Overseas, it managed to build a very strong team. Yeah, there were really good and smart people working there, highly professional, with very good outreach skills. So they were good sellers. Yeah. And that's what they were marketing these services, these projects. But then the executors of the projects probably were less successful. And I think there is a number of reasons for that. So first of all, it's due to the simple fact that after Chernobyl, there was 20 years when basically nothing was built and some of the competences were lost. It's the industry where you need this scale, yeah, just to prevent your competences from being destructed or lost. And then the new generation, simply the new generation of workers, because also during Chernobyl catastrophe, significant part of the people who knew how to do it were simply lost. They died trying to fix the consequences of Chernobyl. So there was this gap. There were geopolitical problems because some of the projects, they were like trying to proceed and then blocked because of the geopolitical considerations. There were some obvious mistakes there were also cultural difficulties, like in Finland, where actually Rosatom didn't manage to find common language with the Finnish counterparty. Yeah, so many reasons why it didn't fly as well as Rosatom Overseas was promising. But still, we can say that there was this expansion, and that partially it was successful, which is already not that bad. And Russia prevented its status of nuclear energy exporter, yeah, exporting the equipment, which was also not that simple. If you look at the international, at the global nuclear industry, I mean, not many countries managed to do that.
Right. I have gone through many interviews with Alexei Likachev, who is the boss of Rosatom. And you know, I have a little bit of mixed feelings about what sort of opportunities and threats are there for Rosatom in 2023, 2024. Because, you know, people are aligning with the sanctions, with all that movement that we have. Also, you know, partially the Russian technology is connected to the military and the space program, and we see some failures, and all that geopolitical dynamics have some impact on nuclear energy. We also have the big dynamics of the climate change, so the renewables and green energies. So in that sort of web of problems and threats, where can you see Rosatom this and next year?
That's a really difficult question because, on one hand, yes, Rosatom is under very strong pressure, and it is not without reason regarded as potentially participating also in the military activities, dual purpose. It's like inherited, but at the same time, you will not see Rosatom in the sanction list. Rosatom itself. And you will probably be surprised to find out that Rosatom is still supplying nuclear fuel to many European countries, to the US, and to the other G7 countries, which are imposing embargoes on crude oil and discussing, potential restrictions on LNG. So, I mean, nuclear fuel is quite different. But the dependency, I mean, people are mainly talking about how much Europe was dependent on Russian gas. Nobody is discussing how much the US is dependent on the Russian nuclear fuel. Yeah, and the numbers are huge. It's above 30%. Yeah, so it's comparable to the European dependency on Russian gas. And therefore, Rosatom has these special conditions. It is treated in a special way. As there is no replacement for this fuel at the moment. Yeah, the West has to find some appropriate ways to deal with Rosatom. So in this respect, it has more favorable situation compared to, let's say, Rosneft, for example. But at the same time, all nuclear projects, they are very long term, they are very expensive, and they are very politically and geopolitically sensitive. So if the government of a country goes into agreement with Rosatom, it means not just building a power plant. Yeah, it means much more. It's a sort of geopolitical alignment. And for many countries which would be potentially interested in getting nuclear power plants because their energy demand is booming and they have energy poverty and their population needs this electricity. But they are very cautious in getting anyhow engaged with Rosatom because they do not know what will be the geopolitical consequences and whether they will face secondary sanctions one day, not now, definitely, but maybe in 5 years. And the construction time for nuclear power plant is 10 years. So you need to think strategically before you go into these projects. And this is probably the main reason why it is now all stuck. and everybody is just observing, not making the first move. We will see how this whole geopolitical situation will evolve in the future. And I suppose there could be some countries which will decide, okay, I will take a risk. I will go into the joint project with Rosatom because actually, even before the war, Rosatom was providing very favorable financial conditions to their clients. Like, we are paying for everything, Russian government is providing loan for everything, and then for 40 years you pay some fixed fee back. Yeah, it's extraordinary actually on the market. And I assume that now these financial conditions might be even more favorable because Russia is getting isolated and it needs such type of projects in order to expand its political influence. But again, I'm not sure that in the next couple of years there will be any countries ready to take political risks of doing business with Rosatom.
I can also confirm that by a case study in Hungary, where they are building the nuclear plant. And for my students and international audience, that's a very nice case to study, because when you go to the official website, you can see those financial guarantees. It's just on the sideline of the main document, but it's like 3 billions there, 2 billions there, everything in dollars, of course. And this is that nobody can provide, yeah? Because when you're dealing with other like South Korean companies, American companies, or French, you have to pay for what you get, because this is how it works. I mean, it's maybe impossible to get that such conditions from French government or South Korean government. So this is very interesting case study. Highly recommend for my students to go through. The last questions dealing with the nuclear topic is the Russian-owned nuclear energy security. What sort of stage is this area, area of energy in Russia at the moment? How is the refurbishment of the nuclear plants or building brand new nuclear plants? How's Russia in this?
Again, it's rather difficult to say. I mean, the official numbers and the official presentations of Rosatom are always claiming that they are very much focused on safety and security, and that they are providing all the maintenance and refurbishment needed, and that everything is up to date. So the disclosures that they are making for the International Nuclear Agency and so on, they are looking quite convincing. Yeah, but I cannot swear that that's the reality that we have on the ground, especially now during the war, when actually the whole transparency of the Russian energy sector has decreased a lot. I mean, similarly to the transparency of the Russian economy. Nobody knows for sure what exactly is happening there, because now you cannot trust any statistics, you cannot trust any numbers. There is no way to double check them. Yeah, that's the problem. But basically, well, I would assume that it should be okay, as much as anything can be okay during the war. Yeah, speaking about security and safety.
Sure. Also, this topic, it opens many doors, because nuclear energy, we have examples from Fukushima, from Chernobyl, and from other that were not that much published. So this impacts the whole world, because if you have the explosion of the gas plant or something, it's mainly local. It's disaster, but it's local. But if there is a neglected Russian nuclear plant, which officially was portrayed as okay, but it wasn't okay, that's a serious global problem. So I think this is one of the implications of the war, unfortunately, for the whole global energy community, that we don't have that access to those data. That's my humble opinion about it.
Yeah, and I would echo that. It's 2 months since Prigozhin's unity. Yeah, and the news were yesterday about the crash of his airplane. Actually, his route to Moscow was lying close to several nuclear plants and objects. Yeah. So just imagine if there is a military attack of some group of bandits, actually, so armed people with unclear purposes and pretending that they are looking for fair revenge, whatever it means. If we are talking about nuclear states, we are expecting that there is social and political stability inside, that there are no private armies moving inside and conquering cities. It's no longer the case for Russia, as you can see, unfortunately.
Yeah, let's touch a little bit Igor Sechin's business, and that's the Russian oil, our favorite. So just for my students, let's speak about the Rosneft as a company. So if we cut off the European oil supplies, how big is Rosneft as a company? And how can we portray the Rosneft internationally so we can imagine the power of the Rosneft?
Initially in the end of 1990s, in the beginning of 2000, Rosneft was a minor, neglected company which was consisting of the assets under the state control, which nobody wanted to privatize. 4% of Russian total oil output, nearly nothing. But Igor Sechin, who took over, who was actually as a representative of the state managing those unwanted assets. During his work in the presidential administration, he was like supervising them. He started to accumulate power and additional assets under this umbrella. The first were the assets of Yukos, which were transferred to Rosneft. And then there was a series of mergers and acquisitions, mainly unfriendly, which allowed Sechin to accumulate now nearly 50% of all Russian oil production. So it was an amazing journey from less than 5% to nearly 50% of all output and exports. So it's really the state flagship company, which is, and I mean, I'm not sure how the situation will evolve even in the nearest future. You can see that during the last couple of months, there were very significant changes in the asset ownership in Russia. And I assume that this process of nationalization or transfer of control has started already. It will not avoid the oil industry, and there are all the preconditions to expect that Rosneft will see a further expansion of its assets under control.
How is the world with the Rosneft? I'm speaking about, we have those volumes of the Russian oil, which is exported from Russia to the world. And how can we imagine that quantity, that volume? How would be the world without Russian oil? So let's imagine that Russia is a closed country, can't export even one drop of oil, That would be a significant problem for the world, or how would it be?
If it happens overnight, I would say it will be the world of like 200, 250 or $300 per barrel oil. Because it's a shock. These actually 7 to 8 million barrels per day of oil, petroleum products that Russia is supplying. It's impossible to replace quickly. There is simply there are no such reserves or strategic stocks in the market available to replace it. Another problem is that Russia also doesn't have any place to store all these volumes. And actually there were some similar fears back in 2022 when the war started. You remember the oil price has jumped significantly, but then people realized that actually the oil still keeps going. And if we are looking at the statistics of 2022, actually Russia hasn't decreased its export volumes. The destinations have changed. So Russian oil is no longer going to Europe, to the US. Volumes going to OECD Asia countries have decreased significantly. Most of the oil ends up now in China, in India, in Turkey, in the Middle East. But nevertheless, the volumes are pretty the same. Yeah, so we didn't see yet any real constraint on the Russian volumes. If this constraint is imposed or happens accidentally, then it would be extremely painful for the whole world, especially for the emerging markets and for the developing economies, which are most vulnerable consumers, most sensitive to the price.
One question for my students, and it's quite a tricky question. We were discussing how Russia exports oil and all those dodgy sort of schemes. And my students are interested if it's possible to track the origin of the oil internationally. So, for instance, they were thinking India or China buys oil from Russia and then resell that oil internationally to some international company, and that company then sells the oil to Europe, to America, or to different countries. So is it realistically possible to track the origin of the oil?
Well, in a perfect world, definitely yes. If the producer or the initial supplier is transparent and willing to disclose all the information. Yeah, but actually right now we have an absolutely opposite situation when Russian oil companies are doing everything to hide the origin of the oil. Yeah, and I would say they are very smart and creative in finding the ways how to hide it. So you see like Kepler and Bloomberg and the other companies, they are trying to track the tankers. They are trying to monitor from satellites what is happening. The tankers are switching off transponders. They are like going for transshipment in the night, in the middle of the sea. So it is a race. And some of the tankers are getting tracked. The others succeed in their hiding. So basically, already now we do not have a clear picture of all the movements and of all the origin of oil. The sanctions, the price cap imposed by G7 in December last year, it was actually requiring the supplier to provide all this information, and it was also required by for the financial institutions and insurance companies and shipping companies if they want to avoid price cap mechanism. But as you see, Russia managed quite quickly to build up its own shadow fleet, which is not supposed to report to anybody. It found lots of counterparties in the developing countries, shipping companies, which are not part of G7 club, or local insurance companies. I mean, who can control local Chinese insurance company? And therefore, there is no implementation mechanism at the moment which would force all the stakeholders, all the parties involved in the oil supply to disclose obligatory the origin of oil. So on one side, there is a strong will of the Russian companies to hide this origin. On the other side, there is no real strong implementation mechanism which would force everybody to disclose this origin. As a result, we do not know the origin.
There is also a case from Azerbaijan where Russia supplies oil to Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan sells the oil. And I read few articles that it wasn't always transparent which oil is basically sold, if it's Azeri oil or is it Russian oil. So that's also the international case. And as Tatiana said, it's quite complicated in some cases to go and to see the roots of the problem, or some speculation or speculative capital, which is always in the oil business. So that's quite an issue also for research. I want to speak about one thing. Igor Sechin usually gives his most influential speech in Italy. In Verona, there is Verona Eurasian Economic Forum. And last year he said, there is no single energy market anymore. There are no rules. And my question would be, who is basically setting up the rules when you have the oil energy market? I mean, the global one. Do we have any regulatory body that have some guidance? Or is it always, OPEC versus some independent companies? How is this? Because this is quite interesting area for not only for my students, but also the international audience. If I want to sell or buy oil, what should I follow?
So actually, it's more of a tradition. Yeah, the rules which evolved with the time, starting from the mid 20th century. As the financial institutions and financial framework was evolving, the stock exchanges, the oil spot markets, where oil is traded, the benchmarks which are used for this trading, the financial brokers and financial institutions which are serving all these transactions, the insurance companies which are insuring them, the shipping companies which are delivering this oil. So there is no single regulatory body, but I would say the London market or New York market or Dubai market, spot markets, the regulators have a strong word actually in how oil is traded, because these are the rules of these marketplaces where it is. I mean, it's a small fraction of oil that is sold there, but the price is produced on these marketplaces. The price which is then used for all the physical transactions around the world. And with the physical transactions, again, for many decades, the main buyers were Western companies. And therefore, as the buyers, they had this luxury of requesting certain institutional framework, certain transaction mechanisms which would be acceptable and convenient for them. That's how this market evolved. And then the others were just joining these rules of the game, rules of commercial interaction. And it just happened historically that, for example, dollar was the main currency for all these transactions because the major market was in the US, and because the pricing was happening in the New York exchange. It was not imposed or forced by anybody. It just happened. What Sechin was talking about in this Verona forum, which, if I'm not mistaken, was taking place last year in Azerbaijan, actually. This is the desire, actually, of the Russian Federation, first of all, but there are several other countries which are also interested in this, to create an alternative system. First of all, alternative marketplaces, alternative pricing, alternative financial procurement mechanisms, how to execute all these payments and transactions. Why? Because Russia has got under financial sanctions and can no longer enjoy the existing framework. It has to create an alternative framework together with Iran, together with Venezuela. So there are several outsiders now which need badly to have their own system. And this alternative system is also actually interesting, at least for the major consumers in the developing countries, for China, for India, because it allows them to get more beneficial conditions. Yeah, to pay for this oil in their currencies, and you can see now that actually RMB payments for Russian oil are already reaching like 50% of all payments. India is buying Russian oil mainly paying in rupees, which is extremely inconvenient for the Russian oil companies because then they do not know what to do with these rupees. Yeah, it's not an easily convertible currency. Yeah, it is all like stuck in India. And they are trying to find the goods they can buy in India using these revenues. But it's very good and very beneficial for India itself. And as a result, we see this like new evolving coalition. And I assume that the BRICS summit, which is ongoing right now, yeah, it is also calling for this more active action of the developing countries and, let's say, non-aligned countries. Yeah, this movement of non-alignment, which India was leading back in 20th century, now it's getting back to the front stage, like something new and very attractive for the countries, for the rather poor countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia. So they are trying to benefit actually from this conflict between Russia and the West, and they do benefit from it. But frankly, I'm not convinced by this statement of Sechin that the energy market is ruined. It's and that there is no single energy market. The market is there, but Russia is getting excluded from the market. That's the problem for Russia.
Right. We also know that there is price cap on Russian oil. And I was thinking, that price cap is set up at certain dollars per barrel. But what is the price of Russian oil when the Russia is profitable and when, it's like the price is okay for Russia to sell? And if we can compare this with that price cap, because, the price cap is quite theoretical. It's like $50 or $60 or something like that. But many people, they have no idea if the $50 is like good price or not a good price for Russia to sell the oil. So can we clarify a little bit that price for the Russian oil? Because you were studying and researching this for years, so you probably know how is this developing.
Yeah, look, it's a bit artificial. So right now the price cap is at $60 per barrel. But talking about, let's say, costs of Russia. Yeah, so break-even cost for Russia to produce and transport this oil to the border, let's say. It is this number is always changing depending, first of all, on the taxation. Yeah, and taxation in Russia is being adjusted every quarter, actually, depending on the ruble exchange rate, which is jumping very significantly in August in particular. So all the numbers that I will tell you, they are very rough. It's an estimate, but it is something in the range between $30 and $40 per barrel, depending on all these factors. For example, back in 2020, when COVID started, and you remember it was like a catastrophic situation for the oil exports because suddenly the demand collapsed, and you remember there were negative futures oil prices. So that was really very, very painful. For the first couple of weeks, the Russian energy ministry was saying like, okay, relax, we are still comfortable with, let's say, $45 per barrel, $40 per barrel. But when the prices crossed the threshold of $35 per barrel, It was immediately the moment when Russia went back to the dialogue with OPEC. So I think it is like an experimental evidence of something around $35 per barrel. It is 3 years back. So now there are and the situation on inside Russia, in the Russian economy, has changed a lot. But I would say, well, maybe $30 per barrel, given that Russia can't devalue ruble as much as it wants now. Yeah. And if you compare it with $60 per barrel cap price, yeah, there is a good margin.
So the price cap is like working, like ironically for Russia. We can conclude in this way. If you want to sanction Russia, you have to be a little bit smarter in this area, I think.
It's it's not that much the question of the level of the price cap, because it has partially destroyed. So it has moved Russia away from the most profitable markets. That's for sure. Yeah, but the enforcement mechanism, it really doesn't seem good. During the last month, the Russian oil price has exceeded basically everywhere the level of the price cap. It happened already. It is in the reports, it is in the numbers, it is in the custom statistics of India, China, and so on. And the enforcement mechanisms, they simply do not work. So that's the problem. So if G7 countries would be able to force all the actors on the market to follow these rules, probably we would have seen a different outcome. But they can't do it at the moment. And therefore, yeah, the price cap is not working.
Let's turn to natural gas, and there are companies like Gazprom and Novatek. So let's start with Alexei Miller and Gazprom. After Nord Stream and those incidents, and basically the natural gas flow to Europe was cut, and there is only a small portion of gas going through Ukraine to the Central and Eastern Europe at the moment that we have, and also we have some flows which go to Turkey and southern part of the Europe. So this is basically a big limitation for Russia, because Russia was very optimistic that basically Western world joined when the Nord Stream 2 was built. So it was like international project, and it was a big enthusiasm about supplying Russia with the new pipes. But this is all gone. And Ukraine said that they don't want to prolong the transport of Gazprom gas to Europe. So this will be, I assume, another limitation for Gazprom. Chinese are negotiating very hard when it comes to gas price and all the conditions. It's not that as pink as portrayed by some media. It's a quite problematic area when you speak with real experts and people behind the scenes. So when we put all this and we underline everything, what options does Russia have to export natural gas when we speak about the pipes, not LNG, but the pipes?
That's a billion-dollar question, literally.
Therefore, you are here.
Yeah. So look, nobody among my fellow colleagues believed that Gazprom voluntarily would cut gas supplies to Europe because it was such a profitable and luxury market. And remember, it started well before the explosion of the Nord Streams. Yeah. So shooting its own leg, yeah, no problem. And once it happened, I assume it will be nearly impossible to restore the pre-war levels of Russian gas pipeline exports. So, as you correctly point out, the Ukrainian transit is a very big question mark. In addition to Ukrainian route, there is only Turk Stream left if we are talking about westwards exports. Turk Stream is working at full capacity. There were these discussions last year, beginning of this year, between Putin and Erdogan on the Turk gas hub. Yeah, and we can see already from their comments that they both understand it in a different way. And anyway, none of them was mentioning any physical infrastructure, any new pipelines to be built. Yeah, so it's something, maybe swaps, maybe some trading, whatever it means. But physically, Russia cannot transport more gas through Turkey than it is transporting right now. And I cannot imagine any new pipeline being built as long as Russia is under the sanctions in this part of the world. So then we have this Power of Siberia 1 building up its own capacity to the full capacity of 38 BCM. We have all these discussions and negotiations about Power of Siberia 2, which is still in limbo, despite all the efforts from the Russian side, which is really pushing very strongly Chinese to go into this agreement. China seems to be quite calm and skeptical, and they do not want, I assume, to hurry up with this project. It will probably happen one day when China will need this additional gas, but it can happen. Remember, the negotiations with Power of Siberia 1 took 10 years, so I wouldn't be surprised if there will be a similar outcome with Power of Siberia 2. And then the only realistic alternative that Russia has for the pipeline exports, it is Central Asia. Yeah, so you cannot go west. East is limited. You go to the south. Yeah, and actually, this triple-side consortium, triple-side union, which Putin called to create last December, addressing Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Initially, these countries were very reluctant and even scared, I would say. Now they seem to slowly get into this arrangement because they are surprisingly facing severe gas deficits in their domestic markets. At the same time, they have export obligations to supply 10 BCM each to China, and they have to fulfill these obligations because it's very important for them, both from the economic and geopolitical point of view. But their domestic markets are then left without sufficient gas volumes, and Russia can fill this gap. So they are buying gas they are arranging now to buy gas from Russia for their domestic markets. Of course, it's not a luxury European market, not at all, not in terms of volumes, not in terms of prices, but at least something, some monetization of the gas. Russia is also supplying gas to Azerbaijan, similar scheme. Azerbaijan is domestically consuming Russian gas and sending its own Azeri gas to Europe via Tanak, TAP, and so on. And there is also a really challenging project on the table to transport gas through Azerbaijan to Iran and then through Iran to the Gulf. Yeah, and to build together with Iran either pipeline to India, yeah, which they are discussing for the last, 20, 25 years, something like that. I mean, Iran and India are in discussion. So potentially Russia could join this idea, or building LNG plants in the Gulf on the Iranian territory jointly together with Iran, and then export LNG. Seems a bit crazy from the economic point of view. But potentially some minor volumes could go there through different swap operations. But all in all, I would say I do not see, at least until the end of this decade, any significant increase in the Russian pipeline gas exports compared to what we see today.
Do we have any numbers when you have all that pipe gas? What's the percentage that Russia needs for domestic consumption? So we can imagine, what sort of volume goes to the export and what Russia actually needs.
It's very simple. Before the war, Russia was always consuming 2/3 of gas and exporting 1/3.
1/3. Okay.
So basically, domestic market is more than sufficient for the functioning of the gas industry, for the stability of the gas pipeline network. It's different compared to oil.
And one question from my students: when you have all those pipelines and it's like web, going from Russia to the West and then continues, can we use those pipelines for anything else? Like some people, thinking about hydrogen or some alternative fuels going through those pipelines. Is it realistically possible to do this or not?
It depends, first of all, on the age and the quality of the pipelines. So, Gazprom itself was announcing that the pipes in the Nord Stream are potentially applicable for hydrogen transportation, or at least for the transportation of the mixture of methane and hydrogen. Yeah, so they were like the newest pipes with very high quality insulation. Some of the oldest ones probably would not fit it, but this is a discussion which many countries in Europe have, like converting traditional gas pipelines in the hydrogen pipes. It is requiring additional research and testing. There are some challenges on the pipeline on metal fragility and so on. But theoretically, with some additional efforts and some additional chemistry, in some cases, it is possible.
Right. There is a place in Russia called Portovaya near St. Petersburg. And this place, was like unknown a few years ago, but now it's the most popular destination when people are looking for LNG in Russia for research, because we know that Portovaya is supplying and it is still supplying at the moment European Union with the LNG. So Novatek is in charge of LNG in Russia. We know that Gazprom is, flirting with the idea of having also LNG, terminals and all that equipment. But I am interested in one question, and that's the ability of Novatek to compete internationally on LNG market. Let's assume that European Union will say, we're not going to buy more LNG from Russia. What can Novatek do? And what sort of destination are there in the world for Russian LNG?
So Novatek and Gazprom are competing quite strongly since probably 2013. Yeah, so it's already a decade of this competition. And accidentally, it happened last year or beginning of this year that Novatek started to win because of dramatic reduction in Gazprom's pipeline exports. Right now, if you look at the numbers, actually the volumes that Gazprom is still exporting and the volumes that Novatek is exporting as LNG, they're comparable. And as Novatek is building up now Arctic LNG 2, there will be more LNG coming from it, while Gazprom is not that successful, as you've mentioned, neither in the pipeline, in the new pipeline development, as we've just discussed, nor in LNG construction. It has lots of plans, but they never materialized. So Novatek is becoming the new national champion in gas exports. And so far, LNG was not under any restrictions in Europe. There was embargo imposed by the UK, Canada, and the US, which were not like big destinations for the Russian LNG, but elsewhere it is accepted. There are, as you mentioned, some discussions inside the EU whether to ban Russian LNG. But it seems that most of the expert politicians and commercial companies agree that in the next few years it will create more damage to the EU rather than to Novatek, because LNG is flexible and it's possible to redirect it. And it can go to Asia, it can go to Latin America like Chile, yeah, it can go to India. Novatek is supplying all these destinations and not necessarily going there physically. They can make swap operations with the other LNG producers. So in this respect, of course, Europe is the closest market with the highest margin. But okay, it will not be like 15 days, it will be 30 days or 60 days to reach the other point. The margin will decrease, but Novatek will still be able to sell this LNG. And my impression is that it is absolutely capable of finding markets for the LNG, at least for the next 3-4 years, until the next wave of new LNG projects will come on stream. LNG market is very cyclical. Yeah, you have a period of strong deficit, then and everybody starts to invest. Then you have a lot of new LNG projects coming simultaneously to the market. There is a strong competition. Prices are going down. Nobody is investing. Yeah. So right now we are in the deficit stage. Nobody was investing during COVID. Yeah. And they started to invest last year. It takes like 5 years. In 5 year time, there will be again this period of oversupply, most likely. And then it will be testing Novatek's ability to market its LNG. But before that, I think they can feel quite comfortable.
One of the questions from my students is, Gazprom is associated with Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin, Igor Sechin, and all those groups. But Novatek has sort of independent company. Like sort of like the description of the company. Can you explain the difference between Novatek and Gazprom from that point of view?
Well, in Gazprom, the state holds 50% shares, so it's state-controlled company, clearly. And there are representatives of the state on the board of directors making decision. It is receiving like notifications from the state to do this or to do that. It is also regulated business because Gazprom is owner of the unified gas supply system, all this transportation network. And as a natural monopoly, it has regulated tariffs and so on. It also has pipeline gas export monopoly, yeah, and therefore, again, special treatment and special taxes it is paying for the export revenues. Novatek is different. It is a private company, privately owned. The state has no single share in Novatek. Yeah, in this respect, yeah, it is independent. Yeah, because there is no state involvement and it has nothing to do with the pipeline infrastructure. Similarly to Rosneft, to Lukoil, they are just using this pipeline system. That's the origin of like independent gas producers. It means like non-Gazprom gas producers who do not own the pipeline system. But at the same time, of course, if you look at the origin of these shareholders and the main representatives in the board, you can see Timchenko there, you can see Akimov there. So people from the elites, which are regarded as a close circle of Putin. But frankly, if you look at the most private businesses in Russia, these days you will see very similar situation because that's the way how business is made in the country. Yeah, so you know that.
Yeah, there is a joke, like when you start a business in Russia, and people ask, so who is your Siloviki? So that means someone who is protecting, that you can do the business in Russia. Okay, and let's go to the last section of our interview, and that's renewable energy, green energy in Russia. So we have all those big players, Gazprom, Rosneft, Lukoil, even Novatek in fossil fuels. Who is a player in a green energy in Russia? And what's the stage at the moment? Because there are two implications I always mention to my students. The first one, the green energy in Russia is slightly not transparently, projected. It's quite hard to find information who is doing what and why. And the second one is we don't have visible signs like big projects of green energy in Russia in the scale like we have in the Western Europe, America, or in Asia. I mean, there are some projects, but either they are not published well, or people are keeping them in sort of like, oh, that's not important to publish articles about. So therefore there is that information barrier. So if we go, over this information barrier, what is the real situation with the green energy development in Russia?
So if you imagine a country which suddenly got locked and isolated with all its enormous fossil fuel reserves, which does not have access to the international financial markets and does not have access any longer to the international technologies to develop renewables in particular. Yeah, and it's not only about solar PVs or wind farms, but also about all the management of the electricity system, all the digital tools, all the controllers and software solutions which are needed to integrate this intermittent renewable output. Yeah. So what would you do? Obviously, you will simply burn your oil and gas and coal, which you have no other outlet where to put, and you will simply forget about all these renewables because they are more expensive. You cannot access the technologies. You cannot attract money, somebody to invest there, and you do not know how to manage it. And you have all these lobbies of oil, gas, coal companies which are screaming that they've lost their markets. Now the domestic market is the only place where they can get at least some minor profits. So it is also a very sensitive social issue. What do you do with the coal miners in Kuzbas? Yeah? Those who are not mobilized to the war, they still need some jobs and they need salary. And if coal is not exported and consumption domestically is replaced by renewables, what are they going to do? Yeah. So it's a very difficult question, and I would say, frankly, even before the war, renewable energy was marginal. It was really tiny. It was like 1-2%, if we are talking not about large hydro, but about new renewable technologies. Yeah, and it was very difficult for them to make their way. They found, and I think Anatoly Chubais was the leader of this very strange framework of agreements on capacity allocation. Sounds a bit strange for the renewables, which obviously they have no granted capacity. Yeah, but anyway, they've created some very sophisticated regulatory scheme which was allowing to attract money from the electricity from the industrial electricity consumers in order to invest them into the renewable energy. And they've created a number of solar and wind parks. There was Havel, there was Nova Wind, there were, probably the most active actors were Fortum, Enel, yeah, so subsidiaries of the Western companies, which, as you know, during this year, Fortum was basically nationalized. It has lost all its assets. So I wouldn't expect any strong interest from the previous owners in the development of renewables in Russia these days. Yeah. And for the new management, which is basically under control of Rosneft, Yeah, I mean, why the hell would they develop renewables if they are looking for the markets or what to do with their oil and gas? So there is this conflict of interests, and there is this lack of incentives to develop renewable energy. It was also very important from the global perspective, from the geopolitical perspective. Russia was participating in COPs. Russia was like accepting Paris Agreement. Russia was making decarbonization commitments and announcing net zero. Yeah, in that old world, it was important. In the world where Russia is at war with Ukraine, any of these statements are no longer making the difference in the perception, the global perception of the country. And therefore, it's not needed actually for the political leadership to keep saying that, yes, we are planning to develop renewable energy. Well, frankly, they still keep saying it, that despite all the constraints, despite all the sanctions, we are still in line with our previous commitments. And by the way, we are also planning to develop hydrogen and to export this hydrogen, including to Europe. I mean, will Europe take this hydrogen? I doubt. Yeah, so for me, it looks more like fake statements and some private interests of those who have already invested in several enterprises producing solar panels or building these wind parks. But basically, it is the incentives are nearly destroyed.
As we know, Russia has energy strategy. At the moment, it's till 2023. That's the official document. And my question would be not about the strategy itself for the international market, but for the Russian people. And the question would be, what is the energy security for Russian people? And what's the implication of the ongoing war? In other words, how affordable is energy for Russian businesses, for Russian households, and regular people who basically, to some extent, they suffer from all those sanctions. Some of them, they lost jobs because of international companies or Western companies left Russia. So there are more dynamics going on inside Russia, but we don't have much information about those the outcomes of like what's going on. For instance, the price for gas, for electricity in Moscow, St. Petersburg, I don't know, in other cities, So how is this situation in Russia at the moment?
So first of all, the prices for gas, which is providing for more than 53% of total primary energy consumption, has increased by 8% this year, and another 8 will be next year, after like 20 years of close to zero growth. So it is a dramatic change. It is significant. The price increase occurred in mid-July, so people do not see it yet in the bill, but I assume that closer to the end of the year, with the heating season, it will become much more felt. The prices for gasoline are also growing, and moreover, there is a gasoline and diesel deficit in certain regions. And as the state, in any mobilization economy, the state starts to manage in a manual regime all the supplies, like Gazprom, and it always fails. Yeah, so these deficits and disproportions, they are absolutely inevitable under this system when the markets are not working, when they are just distributing the volumes. So it's already felt, as I said, and especially the agriculture sector is complaining about that, because if they have like 1 week to plant something or to collect the plants, and they are failing to do it in time. Then there are problems with the electricity supplies due to bad management, due to insufficient investments in the previous year. So it is just the problems that have accumulated. Similarly to Kazakhstan, to Uzbekistan, nothing specific has happened, but just the proper maintenance was not in place. But right now there are quite strong protests in Dagestan, for example, because in southern Russia there are regions which are left without electricity. Some regions are left without hot water supplies. So it's very local. It's not like countrywide. But still, it is creating additional tensions in the society. And I would expect, as the way of managing the country is moving more and more to the Soviet model, these local disruptions, blackouts, or some other problems, they will accumulate. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that it is like changing the minds of the people or their perception of what is going on. Everybody is complaining, but okay, what can we do? That's the major instinct. And just referring to the energy strategy that you've mentioned, I mean, I convince you, none of the ordinary people using electricity has any idea of this strategy at all. It is very formal document, which is important only for the ministry and for the narrow circle of energy companies. And they are actually extremely skeptical about it because it was written in a hurry. Then it was they had to adjust it during COVID, and it was approved in July 2020, when frankly nobody knew what is going on and what are the prospects of the global economy, of the Russian economy. It was never, updated since then. And as you can imagine, during the last year, there were dramatic changes which should have been reflected in the strategic document. So I would say now most of people, even though from this narrow circle, have nearly forgotten about it. I think there will be some sort of an update because bureaucrats, they have to reproduce their formal documents. But again, I suspect that it will be as far from the reality as the current version.
Tatiana, thank you very much for your time. It would be fantastic to speak with you maybe for 2 or 3 hours about Russian energy, a fascinating topic for research, for publishing some good articles. But again, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and remarks about Russian energy. I really appreciate that you basically find time for Higher Thinker. I wish you all the best for your research, for the publications. I hope that you will reach like 300-400 in the next years, which I wouldn't be surprised. And I also wish you a good time with your colleagues. And this is very important to have a good background for research, so you can produce very insightful pieces of papers and other publications. Again, thank you very much for being on Higher Thinker.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thanks for great questions. I really enjoyed them. Thank you.